Good morning to you, Nick Hudson.
Good morning, Sonia.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for taking time out this morning to talk to me.
It's a pleasure.
And I've watched a lot of your talks on YouTube. I think that you did with Biz News recently.
Yes, that one's been very popular.
Yes. Just I commend you for your, boldness and just speaking the truth and all of that. You're fantastic. A little bit about why you felt the need to sort of form PANDA, and a bit about the background there.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. We can do that. So I guess at the very beginning of this whole story, I had a very strong sense that there was a massive departure between the emergent facts and the way the media was hyping this and the way people were responding to this epidemic. And that feeling of anxiety was shared by some close friends of mine who had become my close friends because they were calm, rational, deep thinkers. And when I realized that we were all on the same page, seeing a very different story, I became increasingly worried. It got to the point of I'm barely sleeping, I'm really quite distressed. And he said, it's simple. You know what you know, and you're doing nothing.
Right.
And you're not going to be able to live with that. And the moment the words were out of his mouth, I knew he was right. And I kind of committed myself to the path that I've been on for the last year, which is to bring to light the truth about this.
Yes.
And to expose the falsehoods that have led to this absolutely insane situation across most of the planet.
Yes. And it's obviously globally, it's sort of practically every country, it's the same story. How do you think how does the official narrative, well, I know obviously I know you're going to say it differs greatly from what you're seeing in the data, from what you're collecting with your sort of consortium of scientists and
well, the astonishing thing is there are 8 essential elements to the narrative, and all of them are wrong, and none of them are borne out by the data. More disturbing than that is that all the pandemic respiratory virus guidelines that were in place right before the coronavirus epidemic, some of which had been updated in the case of the World Health Organization, for example, as late as October 2019, completely contradicted what was being done.
Right.
And so, the claims, the false narrative, these 8 lies are all refuted by the data, all contradicted by the prior guidelines and the science before March 2020.
Yes.
That has been clear for many, many months. And yet these crazy actions continue. And people say, well, how can this be? Do you think all the scientists are crazy? Do you think all the governments are crazy? Well, yes, just about.
Yes.
And you need an explanation for how that comes to be, part that will increasingly come to light over the next years.
Yes. In the way COVID's being tested, I'd like to talk a little bit about the PCR tests.
Yes.
What's your view on, is this all a scam? I know that's quite a broad statement I'm saying, but what elements do you see as being sort of very faulty and sort of flawed science?
Well, let's maybe start with the elements that are true. I think there is a virus. It's not a new virus. That's a real misnomer. It's a very close relative of SARS, which emerged in the public eye in the 2003 epidemic. It's a bit of a mystery to me why they even gave it a different name. Maybe it's not a mystery. Maybe it's they wanted to present it as something new. But it's a very close relative of that prior disease. And as soon as you realize that, and that's been known since February, before all of the madness started, we knew that this was what's known as an individuum of SARS, which is, so Sonia and Nick are individua of Homo sapiens sapiens. We're both recognizably human beings. We're not separate species.
Right.
And that is true also for SARS-CoV-2 and SARS-CoV-1. They're very, very similar.
Yeah. You would say it's a variant of the SARS, the
it's
original
a variant of SARS.
Yes.
This is SARS, arose by any other name.
Right.
And so that was that's probably the first big lie, was that there was a new virus on the loose. And with that came another couple of rumors or absolute fallacies. For example, that the human immune systems were all naive to the virus. And that couldn't be further from the truth, because even without a prior SARS epidemic, the SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID in a certain number of people, is sufficiently similar to other coronaviruses that have been broadly circulating in the human population for, possibly tens of thousands or even millions of years. And those viruses are recognized by our immune systems. And it's not, our immune systems don't have like one tool for one virus. They slice up viruses, and some of those parts of viruses are in common with other viruses. So we recognize elements of a variant that comes along. And so, that was the root of the evil, was this idea that there was a new virus and that nobody was immune to it.
Yes.
And that has a knock-on effect as well, because if you want to persuade people that the Chinese lockdown was effective, you first persuade them that nobody's immune and that unless something was done, everybody was going to die. You then point out that not everybody died, and then you conclude that the lockdown was effective. So that's another piece of BS that follows. You see, so you start with the novelty, which is false. You move on to the idea of immune naivety, which is false. And then you move on from there to universal susceptibility and the conclusion that lockdowns were effective in China. Right. So there's this chain of a false narrative.
Yes.
And I think that's really the backbone of it. There's then a side narrative that hinges on the doctrine of asymptomatic transmission as a driver.
Yes.
And this also had a very, very flaky basis because, in the words of Anthony Fauci, I think it was in around February last year, he said, in the history of airborne respiratory viruses, there has never been an outbreak where asymptomatic transmission was a driver of the epidemic. There still hasn't been one. Data is quite clear on that.
Yeah.
But asymptomatic transmission as a driver was the lie that underpinned the rationale for lockdowns and universal mask wearing.
Yes.
Both of which also show no effectiveness in the data. So you see this web of lies spreading around the world.
Yes, I do. It's quite clear, quite apparent to me. I just taking you back to the testing of the virus. Now, obviously, you're aware of the Corman-Drosten research paper that was published in Neurosurveillance back in January, and using the RT-PCR sort of testing. There's been a lot of criticism now emerging on these tests. I think there was an important ruling back in November in an appeals court in Portugal that ruled that it came out with a very profound ruling saying that these tests are unreliable and any quarantining based on these tests is actually unlawful. So yet many countries, including the UK, I don't know how it is in South Africa, still continue to use PCR tests. What's your views on the testing, on the actual specific PCR test?
Yeah, so PCR testing is an amazing piece of technology being deployed in the wrong way. And the inventor of the PCR technology, Kary Mullis, warned against this. He said we should never use these tests for diagnosis of disease.
Yes.
What the tests do is they detect elements of nucleic acid, the presence of elements of nucleic acid. The presence of those elements is not diagnostic of infectedness or infectiousness. And one of the problems that makes them open to abuse is that they can be ramped up to almost absurd levels of sensitivity.
Yeah. They
can also be used in ways that massively increase the chances of a false positive. Because of what I mentioned earlier, that viruses share elements in common. Mm-hmm. If you go and look for an element of a virus that is in common with other viruses, you will trigger positive results for completely different viruses. Even for bacteria, we share this, there will be elements of genetic code that are common between viruses and bacteria. And so, your PCR test, if it's only picking up one primer, as it's called, one segment or one element of this nucleic acid sequence, can be testing positive for a bit of your lunch, in the words of, ironically, in the words of Drosten, the guy who developed the Corman-Drosten primers that the World Health Organization signed off on and promoted and that are used all around the world. Yeah. In his words, he said, it's ridiculous to use, this is in the context of the MERS epidemic, it's ridiculous to use PCR testing because you will get positive results for people for whom a particle of virus flitted across the mucous membranes. You ramp the test up to such an extreme sensitivity, and that you then trigger a positive result for somebody who's not even remotely infected. And that's what's been going on here. You've been cycling these tests up to ridiculous levels of sensitivity, and that's given rise to this notion of the asymptomatic case, which in itself is a medical absurdity. You're not a case of a disease if you don't have symptoms. And there the clue is the word disease. Disease entails having some or other symptoms.
Clinical symptoms, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So in my view, and I mean, 4 of the signatories of the Corman-Drosten review are PANDA members. So we're very closely related to the development of that document and the subsequent expansion on the wet lab results that prove the irrationality of you continuing to use this test. So, our view is that it was always inappropriate to be using the test as a diagnostic tool, to be chalking up cases based on positive test results. To be calling the thing a COVID test is wrong. It's not a COVID test. It's a SARS-CoV-2 test at best, if it's used properly with multiple primers. If it's used with single primers, which, there's a huge evidence that has been done all over the place.
Yes.
Then it's not even a test for SARS-CoV-2. It's a test for multiple things.
Right.
And that gives rise to this phenomenon of dramatic ratios of clinical false positives, especially during periods of low prevalence of the actual underlying virus.
Right. So just to recap, so my understanding is there's sort of 2 areas where PCR tests can sort of go wrong in a way, massively wrong, is the sort of the cycle threshold. I think if it goes above 35, is that when you get sort of a high probability of false positives?
Yeah, using test cycles above 35 is truly ridiculous. I mean, right. I think 24 or 25 would be a more sensible, and just for your listeners' benefit, the difference between 25 and 35 is not sort of 35 cycles is not 40% greater than 25 cycles. It's 2 to the power of 10 greater.
Right. Okay. Right.
So that's an extraordinary magnification. Right. Of the sensitivity of the test. When you're out at 35, you're at a ridiculous level. And some territories, people have been using 47 cycles, which is trillions times too powerful. Yes. Ontario province in Canada, which has been the home of probably some of the craziest behavior in the whole pandemic mania, was using 47 cycles.
Wow. That's crazy. Do you know in South Africa, obviously you have different testing labs, and that also different, you know, different manufacturers use different. Do you know what the sort of roughly the standard in South Africa is for the cycle threshold?
We don't, because the information has been kept very opaque. But what we have heard anecdotally is that there's a range of tests being used. Some of the labs are doing a more disciplined job in the sense that they will use more than one primer, so to avoid the problem of other viruses being detected. But even those labs are using cycle thresholds of up to 42.
Wow.
And then there are other government labs which are very shoddily run with very bad laboratory protocols, lots of contamination going on, and they're using these Corman-Drosten primers, which nobody should be using. It is absolute insanity that 6 months after the publication of the Corman-Drosten review, those WHO primers, the Corman-Drosten primers, are being used anywhere in the world. It's mad.
Yes, yes. And then you've got the sort of, when you mention primers, do you mean the genes that they're tested? So
yes, it's the segments of the virus that are being detected.
I read somewhere, ideally there should be 3 genes that it's tested against.
Yeah, and
it's
that's very seldom the case. They're usually using 2 or 1. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Going back to sort of, you know.
Sorry, I think there's a third, and you mentioned 2. You said the cycle thresholds and the number of primers, and those are indeed the 2 biggest problems. But the problems for the Corman-Drosten primers extend beyond that. It was shown that they would, you would get primer dimers where the primers react with themselves. They showed that they were able to generate positive test results in distilled water, you know.
Yes.
So the problems there are more technical in nature and go much deeper, and they're extensively documented in that paper.
Yes. Talking about testing positive in water, other fluids. So it might be a good sort of point to sort of, you know, go to obviously the former Tanzanian president, Magufuli. He gave a speech back in May 2020. Actually, it was posted on YouTube, and I just checked today, and it's been taken down. Probably was taken down a while ago.
Oh, by the censors.
What a surprise.
Yes.
And he mentioned that he'd secretly had animals, fruits, even vehicle oil tested in the lab and it came back, you know, using the PCR tests, and it came back positive for the virus. So what are your views on the former president, on his revelation?
At the time, I remember being sort of amused by it, nothing more. I mean, I was, you know, my reaction was, I'm glad that developing country like Tanzania is not going in for all of the madness of lockdown and mask wearing and all this absurdity, and that, you know, they're getting on with their lives, and how they got there wasn't too much of a concern for me. And I just assumed that, oh, he's probably picking up, like there's probably a lab contamination and he's picking something up, you know, it's not because of a problem with the test. But that was in May, as you say.
Yes.
I don't think Magufuli is any kind of or was any kind of prescient genius or anything like that. He was a pretty nasty individual, capable of some quite atrocious behavior, but you know, he did by, you know, even a stop clock is right twice a day. He did by a hook or crook put his country on a more sensible response to the pandemic than has been manifest in most Western democracies. And so my thought at the time was one of relief. It is a little bit disturbing that he sort of suddenly died under these mysterious circumstances. You know, 4 African leaders who have spoken out against the COVID malarkey have passed away in the last year, and that's kind of starting to get to the point where you have to listen to the people who are speculating about bad actors being involved.
Yes.
But I would also, of course, remind people that being an African dictator is a high risk occupation.
Yes, I'm sure it is. Yes. I mean, do you think sort of now, obviously there was a lot of ridicule against him when he said that, and, you know, like you said yourself, he was a bit sort of, you know, that was in the early days. But do you see now there's more truth in what he said? Do you think, given the sort of
Yes.
unreliability of these PCR tests?
Yeah, he's closer to the truth than the people who really deserve the ridicule. You know, the big names there would be, in my opinion, Bill Gates, Anthony Fauci, Dr. Tedros. Those people have really done the world no favors. They've behaved despicably, in my opinion, you know, causing the world to en masse to discard decades and decades of good science and in the development of pandemic guidelines,
Yes.
all on a bit of a whim.
Yeah.
And under conditions of great conflict. You know, Bill Gates has been on record boasting about how much money he makes out of vaccinations. Big Pharma has made a fortune out of this testing mania and will make a fortune out of the vaccine mania. The conflicts are naked. The World Health Organization has essentially been captured by the Gates Foundation, and that's all in the public domain. You can go and it doesn't take 5 minutes of investigative journalism to establish that that is the case.
Yeah.
And so, you know, these are the people who deserve our ridicule: Fauci, Gates, Tedros, Drosten, Wieler in Germany.
Yes.
And all of the politicians who didn't see through this and went along with the craziness.
Yes.
Merkel, Macron, Boris Johnson, and in South Africa, our own Cyril Ramaphosa and Zweli Mkhize, the Minister of Health.
Yes.
You know, these are people who have truly not had the brain cells to rub together to actually take a step back and look at the bigger picture and question whether this monolithic version of a totally new world was actually not one that they should interrogate a little bit, given that it departed so much from the establishment science as late as February 2020.
Yes, yes. It is amazing how they've just followed sort of the narrative, not really questioned, and gone into this panic mode, sort of a huge overreaction, and doing things that are sort of unprecedented, like you said, the lockdowns, the whole thing about asymptomatic transmission being the driver for the virus. How do you see, do you know a little bit about the Reiner Fuellmich, the class action lawsuit he's bringing against these? Do you have any opinions on sort of that?
Yes, I mean, I'm very glad that he's doing that. I interviewed him on Monday, so I enjoyed it very much. I think those cases are important. There need to be a great many more of them, because, you know, the corruption in this regard extends, I believe, even into our judiciaries in many countries.
Yeah. And
so, you know, we've seen some very unusual rulings with respect to cases that have been brought to the courts. And so you want to diversify here. You want to have lots of different lawyers all over the world bringing these cases, and they will be significant. You know, the consequential economic damages here extend beyond the level of the individual. So, for example, you know, one of his early cases is the situation of a Belgian nightclub owner who had his business shut down. You know, that kind of case. Yeah, absolutely. There's strong grounds for bringing a case there. There's no basis in science for what was done to that person's business. Yes. But you know, the more general economic damages, the scale of it is completely horrific. So I imagine that there will be legions of lawsuits, and they can't come soon enough, because you know, the damages in some countries, the draconian lockdowns still persist. UK, France, and Spain have crazy rules going on. Some states in the United States, there are lots of places, you know the story, and so the damage continues to be done, and that damage has a mortal consequence. You know, we are transferring wealth away from the working classes, the middle classes, the entrepreneurs, at a rate of knots into the pockets of these corrupt and greedy big pharma and big tech people. And they are trying to cover this up with a degree of censorship in social media and media that is without any precedent ever in the history of the world. Yes,
yes. Going forward with sort of, you know, PANDA, what's your sort of vision now, your next step? Obviously, you want to, you know, you want truth to prevail, right? It's all about spreading the truth, the right science, the data. What's your sort of next step with PANDA?
Well, the organization has grown very rapidly. We have a preeminent scientific advisory board now that can help us, points us in the right direction on the emerging science. Although I must say, the most important thing is just having people who are familiar with the old science, because, that was actually in good shape. We knew what we needed to know to deal with coronavirus in the right way. We ignored it, but that's beside the point. So we've got a great advisory board, and we've got a really significant group of active members who come from a variety of disciplines, scientific and otherwise. But the organization has reached the point where we need to start giving it some permanence, bringing in full-time people. At the moment, it's fundamentally a volunteer organization. We have 3 full-time employees, but we need to put in place a full-time executive, because we are arrayed against some massive forces. Sorry, inbound call that I need to kill. We arrayed, massive forces are arrayed against us, and they are utilizing the dirtiest tricks in the book, smear campaigns, and
Yes.
Ironically, what's effectively happening is that governments and these supranational organizations are spouting ceaseless misinformation.
Yeah.
The idea of these fact checkers is to please everybody else, but if you wanted fact checkers to do something useful, you'd get them to take apart the absolute nonsense that's been coming out of the World Health Organization, the Gates Foundation,
Yes.
and any number of governments and public health institutions. They just keep on making this stuff as they go along.
Yes.
Ask old Tony Two-Mask Fauci, and so we really are fighting a massive PR machine that has put forth this false narrative and amplified it massively across all platforms. Yeah. Anybody who challenges that narrative is subject to the most intense censorship.
Yes.
We've had some quite ridiculous things happen to us.
Yes.
So we need to bring PANDA into a more permanent structure, and for that we need funding. So we're trying to stay totally independent of any corporate or political interests. We're a very diverse organization in terms of membership, the politics of our members, and the sort of institutional ties of our members. There's a great deal of independence, and we want to preserve that by trying to stay within a crowdfunding type of paradigm, which is how we've operated to date.
Yes, yes. I mean, it's interesting what you say about the sort of massive PR for, I mean, here in the UK, we've seen, I think the government has spent billions on the advertising campaign, I would call it, for COVID. It's everywhere, TV, radio. I'm sure I don't know how it is in South Africa. It's the same. Yes, it's sort of the same. And obviously anybody speaking against, like you were saying, they're being suppressed, taken offline, banned from, Twitter, or even the original Carrie Mullis interview, I think he did in '93, where he was saying the PCR test is not designed to sort of diagnose infectious diseases, viruses. That got taken down for violating YouTube's, in violation of their terms and conditions.
Community standards, community standards.
Yes. Yes. So it's sort of, and that's the sort of very sort of eerie, world we're living in, isn't it? Where only one narrative is allowed.
Yes, I mean, and let's just point out how ridiculous it is. If I picked up the 2019 respiratory virus pandemic guidelines of the World Health Organization and read them out on air on a YouTube video, I'd have a realistic chance of that video being taken down.
Amazing. Wow.
Because all of the policies that have been adopted contradict those guidelines. So by espousing the guidelines of October 2019, I would be found to be violating community standards because I'm contradicting what governments and the World Health Organization say. And this gets to, if you think that's a ridiculous proposition, wait until you hear this. We did a story on masking children, because in South Africa we have this practice of even toddlers being shoved into cloth masks. Absolute pseudoscientific crap. And it's upsetting for us to see this. So we did a presentation on kids in schools and so on. One of the slides we used was the World Health Organization's current recommendations for masking children, which contradict the pre-COVID recommendations, but never mind that. Okay, so we were using their current recommendation.
Yeah.
And we pulled that slide out of the presentation and made a Facebook post of it to show that that contradicted the current South African guidelines. So we were using the World Health Organization guideline to show that the South African guidelines were inconsistent with that. That was censored.
Wow.
Yeah, so presumably somebody in South Africa complained, and we were not, so we were going against the community guidelines by going against the local authority. So, you know, this censorship has gotten very extreme.
Yes.
And it should be deeply worrying to any sensible, calm, moral human being.
Yes. Yes, you're absolutely right. It should be. It's sort of like the world before COVID and after, you know, and, you know, they've just sort of changed all the the science.
Yeah. And it's just,
their narrative.
It goes beyond the pandemic specific things, just basic commercial sense, common sense. You know, it's a widely understood concept in business and science that you have to be mindful of conflicts of interest. And it's not to say that a conflict of interest is wrong. We all find ourselves in situations where we conflicted. That's not always our own creation. You know, you just find a situation where you are faced by an incentive that makes you not the right person to opine on something or to act in some setting. And so having a conflict of interest is not a bad thing necessarily, but it's what you do when you have a conflict of interest and what institutional safeguards you put in place to make sure that conflicts of interest can't become big negative things. And it's quite simple. You have a process of declaring the conflict of interest, and then you address the conflict of interest by bringing in an independent person to make the decision that's concerned. And media and governments and public health institutions have all simply forgotten this very basic concept. And the result is that almost every single public health person that you're hearing from is deeply conflicted, not disclosing it, and failing entirely to address the conflicts in any way.
Yes. I mean, just when you know, it triggered my mind when you mentioned conflict of interest, and I was studying the Corman-Drosten, the actual official paper that was published in Eurosurveillance. What's very interesting to note is the co-authors of the paper. You've got Olfert Lant, obviously Christian Drosten, and Marco Kaiser. I'm just picking a few of them out. You know, you've got the conflict of interest with Olfert Lant's biotech company, Tib Mobile, who was the first company to manufacture and sort of get out the gate these PCR tests that he helped sort of write the protocol for. And that was never declared when it was originally published. And then you've got Marco Kaiser, who was a scientific advisor for the company, and obviously Christian Drosten, who was part of the editorial team for Eurosurveillance. All this sort of rings alarm bells of conflict of interest. I think they were forced to update the article a bit later because it was flagged, but this just ties in with what you're saying about conflict of interest.
No, and the disturbing thing here is, you know, once the conflict of interest are pointed out and you carry on ignoring that they exist, you're into seriously criminal territory. I think a lot of these people are going to ultimately end up behind bars. Yes,
well, you've got, you know, crimes against humanity, which is what Reiner Fuellmich is, you know, it'd be there's serious crimes here on a global scale.
Yes, and the detail of it will all come out. I mean, the bigger picture is pretty clear. You know, anybody involved in Agenda 201, this famous meeting at the end of 2019, just before the launch of the epidemic, where they sat down and discussed all these plans, which completely contradicted the existing pandemic guidelines and included a lot of the detail of what we're actually dealing with right now. So anybody involved there is, you know, you can see straight away that they're part of the guilty group. But the actual detail of the steps leading from the foot soldiers, the the Drostens of the world and back to the people who are pulling the strings and earning the billions. That detail will only come to light when you put the foot soldiers on the stand. And I think that's the part of Reiner Fuellmich's strategy, which is very sound. You've got to get those guys into the witness box. You probably need to protect them. And then you've got to get them singing like canaries. And then we'll be able to fill in the dots back to the people who are causing this very rapid unraveling round about the end of the first quarter. Because it happened very quickly. There was a space of less than 2 weeks. It was a matter of days when all around the world you can see it happening at the same time, that your Witties and your Faucis go from speaking common sense and good science to absolutely throwing that all away and you don't get masses of evidence emerging in a couple of days that cause everybody to reverse track. If there was new evidence, that would be evaluated at conferences and meetings. It would be explained. It would be shown to the media. Nothing like that happened. They just suddenly reverse direction, and the result is rolling lockdowns all around the world. And within a matter of weeks, you could see that lockdowns didn't work. Yet they carried on. So I think we need to understand exactly what the mechanisms were. There must have been communications, phone calls, pressure points brought to bear, because these guys all turned on a ticky and stopped speaking common sense and started speaking madness. So it's going to be fascinating to see that emerge. It'll take some time, I believe.
It will be fascinating. It's something to I can't wait for it to unfold, really. We'll see where it goes. But thank you so much, Nick, for your time. It was a pleasure talking to you, and appreciate everything you've said, all your comments. Very informative. Thank you so much.
Well, we need more independent journalists like you, investigative journalists, actually asking questions and looking for facts and listening to diverse points of view. That's been sorely missing in this whole campaign. So if anybody needs to be thanked in this room, it's you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.